Well, thank you very much all for being here on a Friday, particularly because it looks like the rain has stopped, so it's time to enjoy the bit of the city before it starts again. It has not stopped raining since I arrived in Quebec City. And as Habib actually mentioned, less than 48 hours ago, I was in Kuwait where the weather was 37 degrees. So you can imagine my shock going back from this weather. My talk today is a bit theoretical, and it builds on a number of books that I have written over the past 2 decades. It is an attempt to chart the transition of architecture and urbanism, particularly in the developing world, from early vernacular traditions to evolving forms in the era of globalization in the 21st century. In heritage programs, and I suspect very much like yours, there has always been a fascination, if you will, with tradition and with heritage. Of course, that's why we actually study it. My intention today is to problematize this fascination and to unsettle this comfortable and secure view of heritage that many of us who are actually in this field have. Am I right? It's this one?
Yes.
Okay. With all of the talk of globalization, the interconnected world in which we live today is still constituted of national societies, and the conditions of the identification of individual and collective selves has actually become very complex over the past couple of decades. Of course, any theory of globalization must start with charting the historical, and I would argue unequal relationship and conditions of traditional societies, their colonization, their emergence as nation states, and their intense transformation in the global era. I'm an urban historian, and my stock in trade is the study of cities and settlements. Scholars have argued that the cities of the world today, and in this particular moment, are becoming increasingly homogenized, and in a sense, very much increasingly alike, a trend that has often been suggested or suggested that it has commenced with the rise of modern, or the spread of modern architecture. I will, however, suggest that despite appearances, urbanism, defined as the form and culture and art of cities, may undergo very little change in this new global era. I will also argue that in the era of globalization, where culture is becoming increasingly placeless, urbanism will still maintain some relevance. I will suggest that urbanism will not simply surrender, if you will, to cyberspace, and that it will continue to be a vibrant arena where it will be possible to observe how different forms of global domination are influenced, mediated, and even sometimes generated by local struggles. Of course, at the heart of this discussion is the question of identity, and the question or the connection between the identity of a people and the form and culture of their cities and the cities that they have produced over time has, of course, been the subject of much research, as I'm sure many of you are familiar. Family, ethnicity, religion, language, and even history in general have all been claimed as identity constituting elements that are handed down in a process that is normally referred to as tradition. Tradition in this case is based on valuing constraint. And in a technological world of limitless choices, the conflict between the so-called traditional, and I always use traditional in quotes, and the modern become unavoidable. To cast the traditional, however, as pure and the modern as corrupt, or vice versa, is very naive. As much research has actually demonstrated, the traditional modern dialectic is very problematic. Dichotomies such as East versus West, North versus South, first world versus third world, even core versus periphery, developed versus underdeveloped, may be considered artificial categories altogether. An approach that takes into account the discursive constitution of culture would, in a sense, recognize that all societies are often constituted in relationship to each other. There's no society that constitutes itself without an awareness of otherness. For example, notice that the dominant term in each of these dualities, the North, the West, the core, is mainly defined in difference constructed in opposition to the other, and is not in and of itself a monolithic pre-existing entity itself. The subordinate term, the East, the South, the periphery, is equally an invention produced in a variety of post-colonial and anti-colonial discourses. as some suggested in much research, that there is no modern without the colonial. And in fact, there is no society that ever called itself traditional until the modern was invented. In studying the relationship between the dominant and the dominated, I have suggested in previous research 4 historical phases: the pre-industrial period, the colonial period, the era of independence and nation building, and the era of globalization. And I have argued that these 4 phases have urban conditions or built forms that seem to correspond to them: the indigenous vernacular, the hybrid, the modern, and the pseudo-modern, and ultimately the postmodern, or whatever it is that we have today. Now, before colonialism, we had traditional communities. Again, tradition is always in quotes, living in so-called pre-industrial and often insular conditions. Although some form of economic exchange may have occurred between these 2 worlds, the interaction with and curiosity about the other was somewhat limited. This was a stage where the forms of settlements may have been an immediate reaction to the surrounding natural environment. So whether we're looking at a city like, Hyderabad, a city whose skyline was once shaped by the wind scoops that you can actually see here. It's almost as if each house is like a person with an arm that is extended up in the air, trying to capture a bit of the cold air in a very hot, arid climate to bring it to the courtyards of these houses. Or whether it is something like the troglodyte dwellings of Luoyang in China, where escape from that same harsh weather actually went underground. Each of these pit houses, they are troglodyte houses, is actually the size of a tennis court. And it goes deep in the ground, anywhere between 6 meters to 11 meters. You can understand that, in a sense, in many of these situations, we're looking here at an example that comes from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where concern for privacy generated windowless exteriors and inward-oriented courtyard houses. In all of these examples, we encounter environments that are supposedly in sync with the immediate needs of the indigenous population. Their settlement forms appear to have been shaped mainly by their basic shelter concerns and the absence, often, of alternative material. They built with what was there. They reflect, possibly, at a subconscious level, a match between the identity of the inhabitants and their limited access to resources. Again, this notion of limited access, this notion of constraint is very important in the attempt to understand what really tradition means and the production of the built environment under this condition. Of course, around the middle of the 19th century, everything changes with the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the emergence of organized political dominance as represented by colonialism and then later, of course, by imperialism. Under the colonial paradigm, the world was divided into 2 kinds of people and 2 types of societies. Powerful, administratively advanced, racially Caucasoid, nominally Christian, and principally European dominant nations on one hand, and then powerless, organizationally backward, traditionally rooted, and mainly non-white dominated societies on the other. The paradigm shift from the traditional to the colonial created a relationship of unequal exchange. It was, in a sense, a master-servant relationship, as this particular sketch, which comes to us from the late 19th century, from the Illustrated London Times, one of the major newspapers of the time. So if we are to analyze the issue of identity in the cities of the developing world and their built environment, we must understand the process by which this identity was ignored, was violated, was distorted, and was stereotyped throughout history. As a work of art, Jean-Léon Gérôme's beautiful painting, The Reception of the Siamese Ambassador in Fontainebleau, is a good expression of this unequal relationship between the newly dominant and the newly dominated. In 1850, the Siamese were forced to open their ports to European trade and to exchange ambassadors with France. When Gérôme was asked to, or commissioned, in fact, to document this particular event, this ceremony, he chose to paint a single moment in which the Siamese envoys kneel down to the representatives of Western imperial might. And it's very interesting because, as you probably know, within the context of Siam, which is now the country of Thailand, the notion of people totally prostrating and walking backward for their king is very common. But it wasn't at all common in the West. So, in a sense, a misunderstanding of this particular portrait has led, as many others have in fact, allowed the problem of representation to become very central, because these artistic creations contributed to the making of the other, and often even to enlarging the gulf between the dominant and the dominated. Several art historians, in fact, tell us that Jerome was considered one of the most accurate and scientific painters of his generation in representing the Oriental environment. And of course, you know, again, those of us who teach architectural history cannot help but use many of his beautiful paintings in what we teach, despite the fact that they may be totally fictitious or not necessarily representative of what was there. It was also Jerome who painted The Snake Charmer, a beautiful painting depicting a scene with a nude boy entertaining a bunch of Arab bums in the portico of the Blue Mosque in Cairo. I mean, clearly, the political intentions behind this artistic fabrication cannot be ignored, a matter that led Edward Said to use this particular painting on the cover of his famous book, Orientalism. A naked boy in a mosque with people sitting, simply being entertained. Come on. Now that the backwardness of this population was actually established, at least to the rest of the masses back in the colonial homeland, it became legitimate to go about reforming it or civilizing it. In some instances, in fact, the colonial regimes proceeded to sniff out the ethnicity of the colonized cultures. When, in fact, it failed to do so, it often resorted to the psychological technique of hypnotizing the middle class, in my opinion, as actually demonstrated physically by the Go House culture in New Delhi, which in this case represents the white settler subjugating the Buddha. Again, not at all far from Jean-Léon Gérôme's Snake Charmer. Obviously, all of this had an effect on the physical fabric of cities and on the production of the built environment in many of these places. Everywhere the colonists went, they introduced their own brand of settlements. I'm talking here about the overall planning model that determined the pattern of physical development and urban development in both the countries of the core and the countries of the periphery, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century. This was an era where the ideas of architects like Le Corbusier illustrate how notions or concepts are supposed to flow from Paris, you know, where white civilization is, if you will, down to Algiers, and then to the rest of Black Africa, all of which, in fact, is French by this time. The colonial era gave us a hybrid urban condition, and we start to see a certain architecture and urban language that, at least at a very visual level, unifies the lands of the colonial empires. This hybrid often borrowed from both the colonial homeland and the indigenous vernacular that may have existed within the context of colonized countries. The British bungalow in India, a hybrid dwelling type, was actually no more Indian than British, just like the Dutch villa in Indonesia was no less Indonesian than Dutch, one may argue. And of course, it's very interesting because even the idea of the bungalow, which I'm not really sure exists very much in Canada, but it exists quite a lot in the United States, from Florida all the way to California, emerges from the concept of the bungalow, which in this case is the Bengali hut. It is, in fact, the house of the very poor peasant in the region, which is Bengal, today West Bengal in India and Bangladesh. So when the people of the dominated society started to rebel against this specific colonial order, they actually had very little to cling to establish their own sovereignty, other than the terms that have been put in place in some instances, as in the case of Algeria, for example, for almost more than 150 years. With all of the baggage that came with it, with all of the ideological constructs that Western countries, colonial countries, imperialist countries had actually established. Concepts, for example, like the nation state. Groups of people living in one region under colonial power, possibly having only a common colonial history, but belonging to different religions, different languages, different ethnicities, and different religions, different traditions, had to often band together to achieve this supposedly more advanced state of being, independence. The few commonalities between them were often highlighted, and highlighted by the political bodies, by the revolutionary councils, so on and so forth, while the differences between them were often suppressed in the pursuit of this noble goal of freedom and independence. A national identity based on short-term political interest and the ideology of struggle and liberation emerged as the driving force behind most of these nationalistic movements, which start mainly in the 30s and 40s, continue all the way until the 70s in much of what we talk about today as the Global South. Indeed, the events of the late 80s, however, and the early 90s, and even until today, in places like the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, and today in places like Iraq, Syria, and Libya, are a testament to the true association of these people where tribe, ethnicity, race, or religion, or even sect, sometimes have emerged as the prime definer of their collective community identities. So in a sense, many of these problems, which were not really resolved during the time of independence, had come back to haunt many of these countries, many of the communities that constituted these countries, almost 50, 60 years later. So I'm interested in how this, in a sense, impacts the built environment. So architecturally speaking, this third phase of independence and nationalism did not immediately change the condition of cities or of the built environment in much of the developing world. Because during the era of colonialism, important and irreversible decisions that affect the production of the built environment had been taken and had been also institutionalized. So, in the Arab world, for example, and I give this specifically as a very stark example, which comes to us from Saudi Arabia, new building codes based on Western norms requiring setbacks, inherited, if you will, from former colonial times, forced the traditional courtyard house totally out of existence. So what you actually see is what is on the left, in the same city. What is on the left existed almost until the 1940s and 50s, completely disappeared and was replaced by what you actually see on the right, at a time when many of these houses, these new villa types, if you will, were not necessarily appropriate from a climatic point of view or even from a privacy point of view. Because of a host of social complexities, this modern housing type was still preferred by most of the residents only because it gave the appearance of modernity. As independence was being realized, there were also a group of people who almost understood the importance of the emergence of the emerging identity in architecture and urbanism. Some architects and planners in some third world countries or developing countries provided some lip service rejection, if you will, of the modern model and the direct copying from the West, particularly with the recognition of the colonial legacy. But while calling for a new, authentic regionalism, they simply ignored that the Western model will continue to shape their cities through inherited institutions and regulations. The more radical elements of that group, people like Hassan Fathi, the well-known Egyptian architect, called for a total rejection of everything that the West stood for and embarked on an architectural course that was primarily based on an imagined history and an invented tradition. Actually, what you see here is the mosque in the village of Gourna that Hassan Fathi designed in the 1950s. The entire village was actually designed using Adobe Block. It was a very unsuccessful experiment, although it did work later, as I may be able to discuss, in giving Egypt a very specific, unique, modern style that is a continuation of some of its history. Now, we've come to recognize that national identity as perceived by governments is inherently tied to the image that the government wishes to project to the international audience, more so than what it wishes to project its own people. The state, through its monopoly of policies and resources, can, over time, create a national culture, even if it lacked one in the first place. Here, a number of questions pop up. Can one design national identity? Can this national identity be designed by a foreign power? This is a question that was often faced by politicians who were governing newly independent states and by the architects or the planners who worked for them. So, the Danish architect, for example, Jorn Utzon, has claimed that his parliament building of Kuwait, which is actually a beautiful building, made mainly of a concrete shell, evokes a traditional Bedouin tent in its form, while its plan, he argued, is based on the old Islamic bazaar. One may ask if the introduction of a building that has this kind of a form can in fact create an institution like democracy. Louis Kahn's famous assembly in Dhaka, Bangladesh, a work of high drama, engages a similar exercise. Some have argued that its form may have been more appropriate for another country with closer links to the Roman classicist architectural tradition that actually inspired it. Yet, it has actually become a symbol of Bangladesh, even though much of its inspiration has absolutely nothing to do with Bangladesh. Today, you actually see this on the keychains, you see it on the bumper stickers of cabs, you see it hanging from windows. It is the thing that Bangladeshis completely understand as their own. So one may ask, at what point does a building get to that level? At what point did the pyramid become an Egyptian form? Like the pyramids of Giza or the Eiffel Tower, the citadel of the assembly, as it's actually called in Bangladesh, may someday become quintessential of its country as well. Some argue it already has. The point is that identity cannot be based on some myth from pre-colonial times. Many nations and their planners have often resorted to the past, a specific past, around which identity may coalesce as a solace against the perceived dominator. The past cannot simply mean a retreat to a golden age before the Europeans, before modern industrialization, for these events have changed us all irrevocably. Respect for the past in the developing world cannot only include times of great achievement, but must also include accepting and coming to terms with both the colonial legacy and the nationalist struggle, I would argue. So if we accept that national identity is a social construct tied to temporal events, it happens, people are engaged in this exercise, it then follows that the urbanism and the built environment that accompanies it can only symbolize national identity as observed by this single individual or this group of individual or community at this exact specific point of time. So again, from a perspective of a historian, this is a very valuable idea. The problem, of course, of national identity is further complicated by extensive global economic exchange, as you all know. Not only do nations have to now mediate between their pre-colonial and colonial legacies, between tradition and modernity, but they also must deal with the effects of globalization and the New World Order. I refer here to globalization, my fourth phase, as the process by which the world is becoming one economic entity, more than anything else, characterized by informational interconnected modes of production and exchange, and its transnational flows of labor and capital under a predominantly capitalist world system. So here, capitalism absolutely reigns supreme. Indeed, the considerable migration from the former colonies to the lands of the former colonizers and the infiltration of ethnic subcultures into mainstream first world, particularly Western societies, as in Europe and North America, cannot be dismissed. The refugee crisis is a very good reminder of that. In fact, this phenomenon has often been the cause of many social conflicts, as these local subcultures often resort to ethnic, racial, or religious allegiances to defend their identity from being swallowed by the dominant majority culture. If you reflect on it, the current bans, for example, on wearing certain kinds of garbs, like the veil, because they have religious connotation, as actually happened in the case of France, is an example of a dominant majority that fears what a former colonized people, now an ethnic minority, and citizens, may do to disturb agreed upon lifestyles. The practices of multiculturalism in the United States, and maybe to some extent in Canada as well, is an excellent example of an opposite ideology that attempts to embrace difference as a fundamental constituent of national identity. Again, that may be a very optimistic view. Many people would argue that we have not gotten to that phase yet. It is ironic that while the national identity of at least some of the former colonizers is undergoing some major change, becoming more inclusive, the rhetoric of national identity of many former colonized nations is moving, unfortunately, in the opposite direction, becoming more exclusive and more directly linked to national, ethnic origin or religious association. Indeed, the 20th century has witnessed the return of states where belonging to a particular religion or an ethnic identity is almost a prerequisite for the exercise of full national citizenship. Here, Israel and Saudi Arabia are such an unlikely couple because they are countries that absolutely maintain themselves as the Jewish state and the Islamic state. This is in fact what led me at some point in time to write a paper that has become very important in political science, despite the fact that I'm not a political scientist at all, called Medieval Modernity, which I may refer to at the end of my talk. During the era of globalization, the reconstitution and reconstruction of national identity, in a sense, becomes paramount. Because for once independence was achieved and once the dust actually settled, the problems of nation and community harmony started to surface again. Of course, there comes a point in the life of these particular societies when they engage in some kind of a reflection and end up absorbing many aspects of their history. And in fact, accepting many of what was left as a colonial history as completely their own. One may ask, for example, when did the forms of the British colonizers become the vernacular heritage of the Eastern United States? Where many people in New England are proud of the fact that not only is it called New England, that the architecture of New England is very much influenced by England. When did the Spanish colonial settlement forms in many parts of Latin America emerge as the traditional architecture that now attracts tourists to these countries and has become the main form of bringing in income? I am actually one of those scholars who believe that all traditions are invented and that it's only a matter of when and how they acquire popular acceptance. Here, and in relationship to heritage and tradition, I would venture to suggest that in all of us, as individuals, as communities, and even possibly as nations, there are two conflicting sentiments. In the first one resorts to tradition, or heritage, if you will, out of fear of change. A change that in and of itself may be totally inevitable. Protectionism against the unknown does, however, turn into fundamentalism. So there's a very thin line here that could easily be crossed and has been crossed by many nations. So this is one sentiment. The second sentiment is characterized by interest in the culture of the mysterious other. And other, again, is in quotes here. It emerges from a totally different feeling, the desire to have choice and to merge with the other and to share in a wider and different collective consciousness. The tremendous movement of citizens across borders and the rise of protected ethnic minorities demonstrate that the two sentiments, both legitimate, are not necessarily contradictory. In fact, they indeed may happen simultaneously or alternatively, based on time and place. Much of my own work over the past 2 decades has dealt with these particular issues in 2 books. Consuming Tradition, Manufacturing Heritage, which is partly the title of this talk, and The End of Tradition. I employed the lens of tourism in the first book to problematize many of the assumptions regarding heritage and tradition in an attempt to understand how built environments are often packaged and sold in an increasingly global economy of image consumption. And this book was actually produced in the late 90s. At the beginning, at the turn of the 21st century, I edited The End of Tradition, and I argued that we have reached the end of tradition too. By this, I did not really mean just simply the death of tradition. I simply meant the end of our conception of tradition as a repository of authentic and hence valuable ideas that have been handed down from one generation to another. So there is no declaration of death here. It was simply an attempt to recalibrate what it means for the current moment. In the era of globalization, nations find themselves having to compete in an ever-tightening global economy. You see that all the time. You read the paper, in the first page of any paper, there's always something about how Canada or how the United States or how Brazil or how Bangladesh is trying to defend its own economy from the global market. They find themselves having to exploit their heritage to attract international investors. Tourism development have consequently intensified, producing sometimes entire communities that catered either wholly or sometimes partially to the other. The new norm appears to be the outright manufacture of heritage, with the active consumption of tradition. It is important to try to understand how global consumers seek today to engage in, in difference and hospitality as economic goods, and how producers and suppliers, often in third world countries, make their living catering for this demand. So in looking at the heritage discourse in this first third world debate, one may notice that while both possess equal desires to explore the heritage, culture, and the production of the other, they have fundamentally different motivations or ways, if you will, of doing so. And this may, of course, be attributed or explained by earlier relationships of colonialism, political nationalism, and economic dependency. Today, as a result of such historical and economic forces, third world countries often find themselves emulating the progress of the first world and adopting its developmental practices, but only without risking a destabilization to their local cultures. This is clearly a situation of wanting to have your cake and eat it too. I mean, I use this not necessarily as a joke, but as you know, at one point in time, as there was an attack on Muslims and Islam after 9/11, many countries decided, okay, we're not going to drink Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola anymore. So Mecca-Cola actually emerged and it became a very popular drink. Thus, as Benjamin Barber actually argues very nicely in his appropriately titled book, Jihad versus McWorld, many nations want the traditions of the veil, but they also want Coca-Cola, or Mecca-Cola if you will, and the communication technology and access to the World Wide Web. Meanwhile, for its part, the first world appears more interested in consuming the cultures and environments of third world societies. That's natural. If you have money, you're not just going to stick to where you are. You want to go elsewhere. You want to explore. First world nations are often, in fact, even the main advocates for and financial patrons of the preservation of third world or global south built environments for what they see as universal heritage. Even when the citizens or the governments of those countries, the native people, if you will, do not recognize their historical value. Now, the case of the two Buddhas in Bamiyan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in Afghanistan, during the time of 9/11, is a very good indication of that, and the outcry that resulted from their destruction. And of course, this is what used to be, this is what is there today. As a wealthy bloc which often feels a sense of guilt and responsibility towards its former colonies, the First World has also tried at times to maintain or assist in preserving the dying or disappearing lifestyles and traditions of underdeveloped people and underdeveloped places. Yet it's often the case that First World organizations, foundations, and governments have engaged in such efforts while at exactly the same time, condemning or rejecting much of the social and political practices of the societies whose traditions they claim to want to preserve, especially when it diverges from Western standards of human rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. Now, in my opinion, this is one of the biggest conflicts in heritage and preservation. The example of the destruction of the Barbary Mosque in Ayodhya by Hindu fundamentalists is also a very good one to cite here in terms of the ensuing riots that occurred. As Kevin Robbins have actually remarked, quote, globalization pulls cultures in different, contradictory, and often conflictual ways. It is about the increasing mobility of culture, but it's also about new cultural fixities, end quote. So while there is a sense that cultural encounters across frontiers can create new and productive kinds of cultural hybridity and global citizenship, there must also be a recognition that restoring or rehabilitating buildings, structures, and functions could inflame further social unrest and division. Indeed, I would argue that the great danger lurking in this new global citizenship, of course, is the erosion of the idea of the public sphere. Now, I'm sure you know the story of the Barbary Masjid, where what you actually had is a structure that is a 15th century structure, not necessarily in very good shape, but it's an old structure built during the Mughal period, which was an Islamic period. It is supposedly also the site of the Hindu god, the birthplace of the Hindu god Ram, and in a sense the destruction of the mosque was, well, this is the birthplace of a Hindu god. How can it be a mosque? And in a sense, the mosque today has been destroyed. And if you look at it, from a historical perspective, you can imagine what could happen, for example, to something like the Dome of the Rock, which, as you know, also sits on the Wailing Wall. What's very interesting is that this case became a very important legal case because the Indian Supreme Court had then to determine who really owns the site. And they came up with the most bizarre interpretation of the law, by which they decided that the mosque itself can actually stay as Muslim, but everything else around it is Hindu. And I don't know if that resolved anything altogether. In the case of Israel-Palestine, you have very similar situations where who owns the air and who owns what is underground, in this case the Israeli government. Okay, so today, and speaking globally, we can distinguish between three types. I'm moving here to the part that actually deals more with tourism and entertainment and what heritage has actually become in this new global order. One may distinguish three types of places that are being produced with the planned intent of making them places for the representation of the cultural traditions of the other. By the way, this is the headquarters of Disney, of the Disney Corporation. The first type is what I call dream landscapes that replicate historical settings based on the notion of using history to create a Wizard of Oz-like place where all conflicts within a given culture are resolved and where all cultural aspects are reduced to their basic representations. In such a vision, all icons of culture, such as architectural style, building typology, spatial configurations, simply become the cultures that they are meant to represent. Authenticity here is desired and is achieved through the manipulation of images and experiences. The ultimate example, of course, is Disneyland or Disney World. I'm actually showing you here an image from Disneyland in Los Angeles, not Disney World in Florida. And such places, in fact, prove that even if heritage is mimicked, history still sells to the majority of people, educated and uneducated, young and old. There's a second type of places which use history, but which have a legitimate claim to an authentic, again in quotes, past. The attempt to resuscitate such places, which at times are even entire cities, by remaking them in their former image, may serve one or both of two primary motives: to attract tourists for financial gain, and to serve as banks of national memory against any potential change. Colonial Williamsburg in the United States is a very good example of such an environment. A replica of the capital of Revolutionary era Virginia, it is arguably America's premier public history site. Yet, like other history museums, its legitimacy depends on its claim to a real history as embodied in actual buildings and artifacts. But Colonial Williamsburg itself has been criticized by historians for many of the same reasons that apply to theme parks like Disney. Some critics have called it a little more than an airbrushed, consumer-oriented patriotic shrine, end quote. Indeed, one may ask, as the park administrators did in the 80s, where is the uncomfortable African-American experience of slavery in this narrative of nationhood? And again, I'm actually showing a few examples here. If you ever visit Colonial Williamsburg, it's an amazing place to visit, absolutely. But what's very interesting in it, and you can actually see images on the left of the structures and even at the bottom. But on the right, in the 80s, it became very clear that the experience of slavery is not present. So the park administrators went out and actually hired a few African Americans to basically enact the role of slaves. Well, guess what? It actually did not help the park very much, because suddenly people were very uncomfortable. They didn't want to see slaves in the act. And so in a sense, this is a major issue, which is how do you deal with recreating that site with that very unfortunate history, and at the same time continue to have the tourists come. Tourists are really interested in having fun. They're not necessarily interested in being burdened with bad memories. Although, of course, some museums have done that very successfully, and we can talk about that if you want. Santa Fe, New Mexico provides a slightly different example of that second type. Here, while the built heritage may be real, its meaning has long been diluted. Thus, although the town's distinctive indigenous adobe forms may be historically inspired, they have been long disassociated from the original culture and historical context, so that now their consumption operates almost purely at a commercial level. It is well known, for example, that much of Santa Fe's authentic-looking adobe structures are in fact cement-plastered wood frame buildings that give the appearance of adobe. And in fact, the building codes in Santa Fe often call for that. The architecture of Santa Fe has accordingly caused one group of critics to label the town's particular style Santa Fake instead of Santa Fe. In this regard, one might contrast what I consider to be the fake authenticity of Santa Fe with what I call the authentic fakery of a place like Las Vegas. And I'll go into Vegas in a second. But I'll repeat that statement because it's really important. It captures much of what I want to say. One might be able to contrast the fake authenticity of Santa Fe with the authentic fakery of Las Vegas. One might even say that places like Santa Fe represent consumed traditions, but not necessarily manufactured heritage. Now, a third type is constituted of nostalgic places that exploit cultural heritage in an attempt to normalize it in everyday life. The town of Poundbury, that originated with Prince Charles and his fight with the British architectural establishment, more specifically modern architecture. The Prince absolutely hates modern architecture. He would have been very comfortable living in England of the 18th century, but unfortunately he lives in the 21st. A traditional English village, commissioned by the Prince, designed by Leon Creer, an architect of a particular stylistic inclination, and built on land that was owned by the Prince. It has attempted to create the feeling of community that has grown over time. So you look at it and it looks like it has been there for at least 200 or 300 years. Of course, the desired effect includes the long stopover in the golden age of 18th and 19th century Britain before the advent of architectural modernism. Thus, all services, which include telephone, electricity, gas, drainage, even light poles, are totally buried that you can't really see them. They are hidden behind the housing. The one single satellite dish that they allowed that serves the entire community is also hidden behind a masonry wall. All that is visible, protruding from the roof of a Poundbury house, is a stately brick chimney or a polished weather vane. The town is derided often as a kitschy time warp. Yet despite its sentimental prestige of outmoded styles and small town concepts, it has increasingly gained favor with its residents as well as with writers and backpackers. As one commentator pointed out, quote, "The effect is as polite and as elegant as English as a vicar's tea party," end quote. But going beyond these three types, which for me typify the modernist engagement with heritage and tradition in this era of globalization, we find ourselves encountering two different articulations or moments today. I call these hyper-traditions and post-traditions. For researchers interested in the study of heritage and place, the far-reaching transformation brought by globalization requires not only a recalibration of the idea of tradition, but also a substantial repositioning of it. This is so because globalization has intensified the process of delinking identity and place. And by extension, it has also intensified what I call the deterritorialization of tradition, challenging the notion or the idea of tradition as a true expression of a geographically specific and culturally homogeneous group of people. Now this is big, because if we do accept that, then in a sense, something is happening to our understanding and experience of place. Now I use the term hyper here to refer to the social and cultural realms created and maintained through contemporary technologies of communication and information transfer that have radically transformed our notions of time and space. I mean, all of you have iPhones, or what is equivalent to iPhones. 20 years ago, we didn't have them. The way we are connected, partly because of these instruments, is so fundamentally different, as actually many sociologists and psychologists have actually studied. than the way some of us who belong to the mid-20th century were raised. Here, of course, it becomes really important to recognize that the hyper-real entails some form of simulation. Here, it is almost the map that precedes the territory to which it refers. Hence, the map effectively creates that territory in reality. Again, people like Guy Debord and Baudrillard have made this argument way back in the 70s and the 80s. In the case of the casino towns like Las Vegas, cultural heritage is indeed deployed. But here, the claim to history is non-existent. It is in such places that the loosening of ties between the signs of a culture and the reference may be most apparent. Quite simply, to optimize the desire of the producers to manufacture cultural heritage and the tourists to consume it, it has become common for both groups to simply agree to dispense with any pretense to reality or to authenticity altogether. I show this particular image because we now know that the number of Americans who have actually visited the Eiffel Tower and have viewed the Eiffel Tower in Vegas is 10 times the number of Americans who visited the Eiffel Tower in Paris. That's not really the problem. The problem is, when asked, the response that they often give is, why do I have to go to a place where I may not necessarily be well treated because I don't speak good French? Or why do I have to travel and pay all of this money at a time when I actually see a similar tower? Yes, it's a replica that is almost 50% the size of the original one, but I don't really need to do more than that. Similarly, while the Doge's Palace does not sit directly on the Piazza San Marco as it does in Venice, such an adjustment in its desert sister, the replica in Vegas, happens to simply be a gambling casino and connecting two large gambling casinos. That's the Venetian in Vegas. Likewise, the Rialto Bridge, which was once the only crossing over the Grand Canal in Las Vegas, is actually connecting the hotel to the casino. Unlike real cities, which often resort to the manufacture of heritage for political purposes, or nations which have willfully allowed for the consumption of their tradition by others out of economic necessity, Hyper Las Vegas is the ultimate simulacra. It's a safe site for the consumption of the heritage of the other. Yet, before rushing to dismiss such projects and places as kitsch, one might consider that in Las Vegas there is no hidden agenda whatsoever. Las Vegas presents the outright manufactured heritage based on the concept of copying the traditional forms of everywhere for the consumption of everyone. In Las Vegas, the local and the exotic are torn out of place and time to be repackaged for the world bazaar. And this leads me to my last concept, that of the post-traditional. The changes that the world has encountered have occurred against a backdrop of an ever-changing frame of reference. The idea of a global world was predicated on the promises of widespread prosperity, of economic globalization, and further belief that this prosperity went hand in hand with delivering the fruits of liberal democracy, as in fact people like Francis Fukuyama argued in his End of History. The betrayal of these promises, however, is evident in growing inequalities and increasing poverties around the world. It may now be argued that the globalization paradigm is no longer operative because its liberatory potential was never realized. So, some see the events of 9/11, and I would even argue rightfully so, as a symbol of the failure of globalization and the triumph of local frustrations that it engendered. Indeed, the euphoric ideal of a global freedom has been replaced by the very real threat posed by globally unbounded and unrestrained others, global terrorists. It is important to recognize that the post-9/11 era witnessed the rise of a new paradigm, one that some have actually called after-global. Not because we abandoned globalization, but because we need to move beyond its limitations. It is after-global because it supersedes the development era of multiculturalism, and it actually replaces it with a unilateral dominant culture. This is not an end of globalization, but the emergence of a different kind of engagement that is sharply at odds with the vision of liberal multiculturalism. Here, both religious fundamentalism and imperial hegemony begin to emerge as the new forms of global engagement. The example that I often use here is Osama bin Laden on one side and George W. Bush on the other, very simply. Identity in this after-global era becomes increasingly complex as the connection between identity and place is no longer determined by heritage or tradition. Unlike neo-traditional settings, such as Poundbury of Prince Charles, or simulated traditional places such as Las Vegas, cities like Hong Kong or like Dubai may be considered post-traditional places. They are places that have acquired a global imageability based on precedents drawn from elsewhere. They are places in constant race, whose history is the current present. All this emphasis on the re-evaluation of heritage and tradition, their role in the production of the built environment, their demise in the face of globalization, all suggest the possible end of tradition. Indeed, if tradition is merely the dialectical fabrication of modernity, then does not the end of tradition as a meaningful object of inquiry suggest the end of tradition as an objective reality? The post-traditional category offers us the hypothetical possibility for individuals and groups, nations and corporations, to choose from a rich display of traditions detached from their previous encumbrances with people, places, or even time. Here, the past of post-traditional places is not only invented, but it's also intentionally ignored in favor of an immediate present that assumes to be the past. Dubai and its Palm Islands is an excellent example that stands at the intersection of this post-traditional condition with what I would call the after-global era. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, actually there's quite a lot of desert land. But the most important part of the Emirates is its connection to the Gulf. So they actually started to build these fantastical planning ideas. This is palm. You can never really see that except from a plane or from the moon. That's the only location where you'd actually know that it looks like a palm tree. But in reality, each of these small structures that you see over here are villas. Each of these are townhouses. And they are owned by the rich and filthy of the world. Michael Jackson actually had a house here, which I was not able to visit when I went there, but I was told that it's there. Now, these post-traditional environments, and here again you look at this, by the way, is the tallest tower in the world, and this is not like a simulated image. This is a real image. This is a real image where the clouds in Dubai actually often come low. So this is Burj Khalifa, which used to be called Burj Dubai, but now it's called Burj Khalifa, which is the tallest tower in the world. The post-traditional environments are not simply places of mimicry, authentically fake simulacra. They are places where the reference ceases to be a fixed moment in history related to place or to nation, and become instead a constantly moving target that legitimizes current conditions, actions, and aesthetics. The connection to both history and geography is severed, and hence historical and vernacular style become irrelevant or simply relics of the past. The impact on urbanism here and in the production of the built environment is that cultural experience may become less place-rooted and more informationally based. Now, this is not necessarily an idea that I have. It has an idea that has been extremely well developed by Manuel Castells, the famous sociologist, philosopher, in his series of books, his trilogy called Information Society. Now, I explored this phenomena in more detail in my latest book, Traditions, the Real, the Hyper, and the Virtual in the Built Environment. My main argument in it is that authenticity can no longer be a definer of tradition, authenticity. I argued that what lasts in tradition today is the fleeting, the transient, and the contingent. I would like to end this lecture with three very quick illustrations of this idea, two of which actually come from the United States. First, I will actually now return to Disneyland and its Main Street, the street that has captured the imagination of many visitors to the park, whether it is Disneyland or Disney World particularly in the American context, as the most quintessentially American, if you will, of all places. And in fact, this particular street, Main Street, was an invention. It was an invention by two people, Walt Disney himself and Harper Goff, who was the first artistic director of the Disney Corporation. And what they ended up doing is that they took elements of what they thought was the important street in their towns, they copied it, and they replicated it in Disneyland, and then they made an additional replication of it again in Disney World, in Florida. In a very strange way, Main Street was actually informed by these two towns, Marsland, Missouri, and Fort Collins, Colorado, from which Disney and Goff actually came. Both of these cities in the 1980s found themselves in dire economic straits. They didn't know exactly what to do. So they went to the Disney Corporation. And what they ended up doing is, in fact, the Disney Corporation agreed to come and, in a sense, renovate the two streets that existed, from which, in a sense, Main Street, which is a fictitious street. There's no Main Street in Marsland, there's no Main Street in Fort Collins. But the towns agreed to have their streets renamed Main Street to resemble Disneyland. So this is a very interesting situation where the fake, or the copy, basically becomes the instrument by which the original can be brought back to life. Another interesting example in this case actually comes from Egypt. And it's a Sabil Kutab. The image that you actually see in the left is from Cairo today. A Sabil Kutab is a water fountain that has on top of it sort of a nursery or a kindergarten school where students learn how to recite, the young students, how to recite the Quran. It's a historic structure in the medieval city, which in a sense, when there were world exhibitions, so the Chicago World Exhibition of the late 19th century was one where that entire structure was copied and mimicked, and this is actually the image of it from the Chicago exhibit. What happened in the Chicago Columbian exhibition, Max Hertz, who was one of the major architects living in Egypt in the 19th century, was fascinated with the Sabil, with the structure. But the structure was in very bad shape. So he decided, okay, well, since the structure is in very bad shape and Egyptians don't seem to care very much, he actually managed to take out certain elements, like the clustered windows and like aspects of the entrance. And he put them on the replica in Chicago. Time passed. The exposition was over. All of the stuff disappeared. No one knew where it was. And in the 1970s, a group of German restorers decided that they are actually going to take over this particular structure and renovate it. The problem is they had very few images of it. It was in really bad shape. But the Sabil in the Chicago Columbian Exposition was so well documented, with photographs and plans and what have you, that the documentation of it as a replica became the source for its preservation as a real structure. Now, I will end this with a personal anecdote. And it's, in fact, my last example. As Habib actually mentioned, back in the 80s, I helped co-found an organization called the International Association for the Study of Traditional Environments. And it actually has conferences every 2 years in different parts of the world with 1,000 members from 50 different countries. In 1998, we had the conference in Cairo. And one of the after-conference trips was a trip to the pyramid. So, the trip to the pyramid, I come from that part of the world. I know it very well, but I decided to still go. And I remember standing, on one of the hills overlooking the pit in which the Sphinx is there. And I heard one of my colleagues who was attending the conference, someone I did not know at the time, but he was a participant in the conference, making the comment, "Oh my God, it's so small, it's so small." He was actually talking about the Sphinx. I was puzzled. What is small? Is it the angle that we're looking at it from? Is it, what is it exactly that makes that comment? So of course I went and actually looked at his badge. I wanted to know who he was. It became very clear. It turned out that the guy actually was a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, whose School of Architecture at that time was right in front of the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. The Luxor Hotel in Vegas has a sphinx that has eyes with laser beams that sort of come out at night. But you know, the problem is that that sphinx also serves as the entrance to the Luxor. So it had to be stretched quite a bit to take the 8 lanes of cars that come under it. As a result, the Vegas Sphinx, rightfully, is 1.5 times, you know, the real Sphinx in Giza. So the poor guy actually was making a judgment that, in a sense, was in reality based on a frame of reference that has been embedded in his mind, which is the image that he sees because he parks his car every other day in front of that Sphinx. When in Giza, he became disappointed, not because the reality did not live up to its image, but because along the way, the reality ceased to be relevant when the image became the principal frame of reference. Simulation is no longer a referential being or a substance. It is the making of images in and of themselves. Of course, it is always in context that we have any reality at all. Thank you very much.